Well, it's now time for this Saturday's Head-to-Head. Joining me is Mike Buckley. He's a journalist and campaigner. And also joining him is Noah Khogali. He is a commentator with Young Voices UK. Very good morning to both of you.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's start with the rail strikes. I don't need to tell you that obviously the unions are going ahead with the strikes on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. It is going to be a huge walkout. Some 40,000 workers are going to walk out, crippling the railways, not just for those days, but actually it looks like it will cripple the network for the entire week. On top of that, London Underground, 10,000 workers going out on Tuesday. Let me ask you, Mike, government obviously not going to give in, has made it very clear the government is not going to give in. Do you think this is the beginning of what could be called Boris Johnson's miners' strike? That is a reference to, of course, the fact that Margaret Thatcher refused to give in to the miners during the strikes that we saw in the 70s and 80s.
Well, look, maybe that's the historical moment that Boris Johnson wants us all to think about, so that he can have his own, big fight with an industry and win, as Thatcher did in the 80s, just, with all the horrendous consequences for people's lives that followed. Of course, but it really isn't the same thing. I was speaking to the rail unions a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying that this is in part about pay, it's in part about working conditions, of course, but it is also in part about their view that the government is mismanaging the railways, and in their view trying to force a managed decline of the railways, because they think that currently, the railways are not being used as much as they were before the pandemic, and the government want to effectively, force them to decline, which we don't need. We need to encourage people onto public transport and out of their cars, primarily because of climate change, also because of air quality. So I think the strikes are unfortunate. I don't want the strikes. I don't think the unions want the strikes either. But if the government are effectively saying, we don't listen, we're not interested in what you say, we're not going to do anything about it, the unions don't have much choice.
I simply don't buy the fact the government is trying to manage to decline the railways. They've been putting in massive amounts of money. What is actually going to cause the railways to decline is a lack of confidence, which we are increasingly having, because no one believes the trains will ever run on time. Noah, let me come to you. What's your view on this, and in terms of the government policy? Is the government right to say we are not backing down?
I think what this comes down to at the end of the day is across the country, various industries, basically every single person is facing a rising cost of living and enormous issues in their personal lives. If we bow down to a union that essentially has a monopoly and can grind the entire country to a halt, how many other times are you going to start seeing this happen? At the end of the day, the government does have a route out of this. So within the Trade Union Act of 2016, there are designated key industries. If you can start bringing in agency staff, which previously has been banned, for those key industries, that starts to break up the monopoly that people like the RMT have, gets the country moving again, backs the British people, and starts to make sure that we can all come out of this together, not as Wes Streeting puts it, as pitching worker against worker.
So Noah, you would be in favour of this mechanism from Grant Shapps saying bring in agency workers?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes perfect sense.
And what about you, Mike? Is that the way out of this?
You simply can't do it because it wouldn't be safe. These people,
why wouldn't it be safe?
Because the trains need to run, and they need to run in a way that's safe.
Yes, I understand that, but
and not have an accident, and that's essential. To say that you can bring in agency workers is to completely misunderstand what works on the road.
Well, he didn't actually say that. He said he could bring in people with transferable skills. They could be trained up.
I'm not proposing that I become a train driver.
No, I'm not suggesting you, Noah. I meant Grant Shapps. But Mike, surely we could... People with transferable skills, they could be trained up. The fact is, I don't think the British public are on the side of the railway workers, and I sense that very strongly.
I think that the union have not done a good job of explaining why these strikes are happening. I think people know the strikes are happening, they don't know why. I don't think the union explained that clearly. I don't think the Labour Party has explained that clearly. Clearly, the governments haven't explained that clearly either. So I think it's therefore no. I'd be very surprised if the majority of the public weren't against the strikes, because I think people don't understand why they're happening.
But I think over the past couple of decades, it's important to point out that polling has consistently suggested that people don't believe that union officials tell the truth. It's consistently, been below half, more languishing about around 40%. People don't trust the unions because repeatedly unions have acted in their own self-interest, not, as they would love to put it, in the interest of the British people.
Mike?
I don't think the unions have always handled themselves particularly well, but I also think that there's a majority of the press that continually briefs against them, whatever the unions do or say. And I think actually the unions are, generally speaking, handle themselves a lot better these days than they did in the past. But I do think on this particular issue that it hasn't been clearly explained to the public why the strikes are happening, and therefore people are going to be against it. I mean, if I'm honest, I do think that the unions should try and do everything possible to fix the crisis before it gets to strikes. I think strikes are a very blunt instrument, and in the end it does impact on the general public more than it impacts on the government. Boris Johnson isn't going to care if we have a strike next week, but the rest of us do. The rest of us have got to reorganise our schedules, and it's really annoying.
Well, not only that, I feel very sorry for the kids in schools trying to do GCSEs and A-levels, which will impact their future careers. I feel sorry for doctors and nurses who cannot get to hospitals. I feel sorry for patients who will miss out on life-saving treatments like chemotherapy, like immunotherapy. A top NHS doctor has said these railway workers will kill people. That is unacceptable.
It is unacceptable. I mean, there's no alternative argument for that. I mean, there will be a skeleton service running. Obviously, alternative forms of transport are available.
Well, you can't get a cab. You can't actually do anything. We've tried in London. There are no cabs available. You can't get anywhere. You've got the Underground going out on Tuesday. I actually don't think it's acceptable to hold the country to ransom. Noah, what do you think?
No, absolutely agree. And if you put yourself in the shoes of a nurse, say, who can't get to work, it's very hard, I think, for them to try and have sympathy for, say, a signal worker who's on 44 grand a year. And start to have sympathy for them.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Sorry, carry on.
So the Labour Party have really, not officially, but lots of the MPs have come out and really hammered down on this very weird line about we shouldn't be pitching worker against worker. But that misunderstands, I think, the state of the country. It's not workers railing against the man. It is genuinely train drivers who are doing a huge amount of work on overtime and signallers on 44k who are putting themselves above children doing their GCSEs, as you've said, people who need critical healthcare, and people who have worked incredibly tough jobs over the past couple of years. This is them elevating themselves way beyond all of those people, and I think that's wildly self-indulged.
Well, I think also when you look at other professions, and I mentioned that yesterday, 44,000 for signal workers. I was told by some people I got that completely wrong. Train drivers do very well, by the way, 59,000 plus overtime. Let's look at teachers, 38,000. A nurse, 35,000. And one of the hardest professions I think you could possibly do is to be a care worker on £17,000. How on earth are they going to get to elderly and vulnerable people? These are people are going to be isolated yet again. They will suffer yet again. And once again, I think we are leaving them to rot, and it has to stop. I'm going to ask Mike.
I mean, I think the point we've left out of this conversation so far is that the government have a responsibility to work with the unions and to manage their employees well, and effectively the railway workers are their employees.
Well, their view is that actually these are private companies.
The government have failed to do it. Well, I mean, they are and they're not. I mean, the railways are effectively nationalised now, I mean, since the pandemic. And the government bears ultimate responsibility to make this system work. And it's government choices that the unions are railing against, not the choices of the private companies. I don't think this has got anything to do with the companies that run the trains. I think this is all to do with government choice. So, I mean, to be honest, I don't understand all the detail of what the governments have done and not done. Clearly, this has got something to do with jobs. It's got something to do with wages. I think it's got something to do with concerns that the unions have over the safety of passengers in the future if staffing is reduced. And it's got something to do with the fact that the government wants to cut lots of services, which the unions don't want, partly because it would mean that their employees would have less to do and hence would get less pay, but also because that would worsen the service in the long term for the rest of us. So there are multiple issues here. The government ultimately is responsible and culpable, and it's the fact that the government haven't talked through and come to an accommodation with the unions that's led us to this point.
Yeah. Isn't actually the elephant in the room that we're moving towards automation, that practices do have to change? We cannot stay running a railway based in the 18th century. No, clearly things are changing, technology moves on, driverless trains, automation, isn't that the way forward?
Absolutely. Unions have always had a problem with modernisation. Even something as simple as the ticket booths loses people jobs in favour of speed and efficiency, and the unions are not going to like that. I would also just drag Mike up on the point made about the government. The strikes are happening in Scotland as well. The SNP, we're going to get onto them later, I know, but did nationalise the railways up here, and we've still been suffering strikes pre-nationalisation and post-nationalisation. This is not just about Westminster. Obviously, both governments have to take some responsibility, but the one constant here is the unions. It's happening everywhere.
Stay where you are, Mike Buckley and Noah Khogali. Stay where you are. After the break, they'll be back. We'll be talking about whether strikes on critical infrastructure should still be allowed. And do you still have confidence in the judiciary? That's after the European Court of Human Rights ruling. Don't go anywhere. This is Talk TV. We're broadcasting live from the Talk Radio studios. Welcome back to Weekend Breakfast. I'm still joined by Mike Buckley and Noah Khogali, who are debating head-to-head. Good morning. Welcome back to both of you. So we talked about the rail strikes. Let's talk about something that I'm just sort of postulating. Is it now time to actually ban strikes for critical national infrastructure? And the reason I ask that is it seems to me that the British people are being held to ransom. People have really struggled through COVID. They've really struggled to try and earn income. They're trying to get to their hospital appointments. And by national critical infrastructure, I'm talking about things like the railways. I'm talking about things like energy, so that you can't have the power cuts that we saw in the 1970s. And I'm talking about the NHS. Mike, I assume you'll be opposed to that.
Well, you need to have a balance between the needs of the government, the needs of the public, and the needs of workers. And workers do need to have an ability to protest when they feel they're being mistreated. And that's a right that we should be very cautious about taking away. And it's already the case that critical infrastructure cannot go on strike. The army can't go on strike. The police can't go on strike. I don't think the fire brigade can go on strike. So that's already the case for a raft of industries and a raft of workers.
Well, so shouldn't we make railway part of that critical infrastructure?
No, I don't think that we should. I don't think the case has been made for that at all. And I think those workers, I mean, it is critical, but it's not critical in the same way that the army or the police is critical.
Noah?
I think there is a quite important bit of nuance here. Obviously, people need to retain their own rights to try and get better terms for themselves. But if you imagine a world where, say, people on a nuclear plant were just walking out, that would be incredibly dangerous for the country, for everybody, for the world. So there is an element of balance. I would challenge Mike to explain why people on the railways shouldn't be banned, but people like the army should be banned from striking. There doesn't seem any logical reason why in a country you should be almost entirely held to ransom by one industry. If you're in that situation where someone like the RMT has such a monopoly, that feels very, very, very hard to justify. And I don't really understand the reasoning there that Mike would have, bar just backing the issue of the day.
Mike?
Well, I just think we need to be incredibly cautious before we make these choices and we take these rights away. And we're talking about a lot of people who work on the railways. I mean, the alternative... That
doesn't really answer his question, though. He said, why wouldn't you?
The alternative is that you just end up losing people from the profession, and we're seeing that happen.
But that's the one thing they're trying to rail against, which is to have to stop redundancy. So in which case, if you actually went down Noah's train of thought, those people who want to leave will leave.
But if you treat people particularly badly, then they are just going to leave, and then you end up with a less good and a bare bones service. And we're seeing lots of people leave the NHS now, very sadly, because they feel they've been so badly mistreated after COVID, without adequate funding, or with facing the labour shortages that they're facing. They're overworked. Same with care. I mean, you mentioned care earlier on, the fact the average wage is £17,000. I mean, there are a host of problems with social care, which the governments are continually failing to resolve. One of the problems is that people aren't paid enough, so people are leaving. Yep. Right enough that the care quality goes down.
Yeah. OK, I want to move on now to the court cases that have been running and the Rwanda plan. The fact is, as you know, this scheme from the government, you may or may not like it, but the fact is it went through 3 British courts. It went through the High Court, the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, and then at the 11th hour, literally in the last few minutes, it was stopped by the European Court of Human Rights. Now, many people I've been speaking to, Brexit supporters, are absolutely flabbergasted that we still, although we've left the European Union, seem to be bound by Europe. And I'd like your thoughts on that, Noah. Do you think people's faith in the judiciary and the way that Britain can actually run its own affairs has been challenged?
It has been challenged, but it is important to remember this has been an issue for a while. There's been this affront between the courts and between politics. that's gone on, over the last decade quite consistently. Even something like the proroguing of Parliament a few years ago, there was lots of legal challenges over Brexit. This has been something that's been a constant. YouGov did polling in 2016 over what British people thought of the ECHR, and even back then, only 42% of people thought that we should be in it. So you'd assume that over the past few years, those kind of feelings have probably hardened, and if it's not the same, you've got to guess it'll probably be lower. We'll see more polling in the next few days, you'd expect. But that's what it was even that long ago. Because it's something that's packaged like a foreign court, even though, and I know Mike's going to come back saying, we had a role in creating it. These are, fundamental rights. But it's packaged like a foreign court. And it's very hard for British people to understand, especially if they support something like the Rwanda policy, why a quote-unquote foreign court is striking it down when the British courts all said it was okay.
Yeah, Mike, are you going to say that?
I mean, I'm going to say two things. I mean, the first is it's not the job of lawyers to have an opinion and to determine whether a policy is right or wrong, or morally or ethically right or wrong. I mean, as you would expect, I think the Rwanda policy is absolutely abhorrent in every way, and I genuinely cheered when I discovered that the flight had been stopped. But the court has made a decision based on what it believes to be legal in terms of its own law, but also UK law. And that's its job.
I'm not sure that's entirely true. The ECHR actually has made a ruling saying they want a judicial review, essentially kicking it into the long grass, waiting till July. And, of course, that means that it will then move ever further. Now, the point is we can do one of two things as far as I can see. You either leave the ECHR or you have a binding motion that the ECHR should have absolutely no say. And we did that with prisoner voting back in 2004. Isn't that what we should be doing, Mike?
Well, you cannot leave the ECHR.
Why not?
Without ripping up the Good Friday Agreement. It's embedded.
I don't think that's true. Actually, I think if we replaced it with the British Bill of Rights, which we're being promised, I think there are ways around that.
No, there are no ways around it. I was in Belfast 2 days ago having a conversation about this, and there definitely is no way around it. It's baked into the Good Friday Agreement. You cannot leave the ECHR without ripping up the Good Friday Agreement. No responsible government would do that. The situation in Northern Ireland it's always been fragile. It's even more fragile due to Brexit and due to the way the government is mishandling Brexit and mishandling the Northern Ireland Protocol. You try and take away the European Convention of Human Rights, and you're in a very different situation over there. And that no responsible British government should even consider even suggesting it, never mind doing it. So it's actually impossible. Well, the alternative that you suggest may be possible. I don't actually know the answer to that.
Priti Patel seems very keen that we leave the ECHR. What about you, Noah?
I think this is where I'm actually going to have some overlap with my I do believe the ECHR fulfills a good function. I don't have a huge amount of problem with it. What I do think that the European Court does need to start bearing in mind is that the legitimacy of that kind of organisation and the subscription to that kind of court is reliant on retaining public confidence. Yeah. The second that you lose that on a mass scale, you lose all your legitimacy. So it may well be baked into the Northern Ireland peace process. It may well be core to protecting our human rights. We can replace it with the British Human Rights Bill. That's by the by. But the European Court needs to make sure that it doesn't start looking like it's ruling over countries in Europe. Because once they start doing it with the UK, it will start leaking out across Europe, and that public sentiment can turn very, very, very quickly. And they just need to be careful that they know exactly what they're doing, especially when it comes to headline government policies.
Well said indeed. Thank you very much, gentlemen. That's Mike Buckley, journalist and campaigner, and Noah Khogali, who is a commentator with Young Voices UK. Thank you very much indeed. Now, after